Live from Singapore, this is Insight with Haslinda Amin, a show where we dive deeper into the stories that matter with crucial context and sharp analysis. President Trump teases a major trade deal, with sources telling Bloomberg it is expected to be with the UK. That's giving markets a boost despite Trump's warning he is not going to ease up on China before their negotiations start this weekend. Even as the US and China get ready for trade talks, President Xi is in Russia to cement his no-limits friendship with Vladimir Putin and showcase waning U.S. influence. And Pakistan's claim that it shot down Indian jets, including a French Rafale fighter, is putting the spotlight on its Chinese military tech. We have a great lineup of guests to discuss the latest tensions. Center for China and Globalization Vice President Victor Gao will be joining us in a moment, with Geopolitical Futures founder and chairman George Friedman. And later, we speak with Indian opposition leader Shashi Tharoor. Welcome to Inside. Markets digesting multiple developments today. President Trump says he's announcing a major trade deal later. The Fed allaying concerns about the U.S. economy, saying it can wait to adjust rates, all that helping to calm market turbulence since the first week of April. Just how long the good news can last as Trump's trade policies play out is the biggest question confronting central bankers. We have the MSCI Asia-Pac Index reversing all losses for the morning, currently trading up 0.1%. S&P futures also in the positive, extending its gains by 0.5% right now. And the U.S. dollar index currently down 0.1%. We're seeing gains in China, the Hang Seng, as well as the Kospi as we speak. Now, the Fed chair is signaling the rate path will depend on the White House's economic strategy, making it clear there's no rush to lower borrowing costs until there's more clarity on the direction of trade policy.
There's a great deal of uncertainty about, for example, where tariff policies are going to settle out, and also when they do settle out, what will be the implications for the economy, for growth, and for employment. I think it's too early to know that.
And ahead of key talks with China, President Trump is touting progress on trade and teasing that big deal, which we're told could be with the UK. Earlier, Trump said he's not willing to preemptively lower tariffs on China in order to unlock more substantive trade negotiations with Beijing.
China says in order to have substantive negotiations, you have to bring down your 145% tariffs. Are you open to pulling back your tariffs in order to get China to the negotiating table?
No.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Trade Representative Jamieson Greer are due to meet this weekend with their Chinese counterparts in Geneva. China's delegation will be led by Vice Premier He Lifeng. In a testimony before Congress, Bessent confirmed that White House Trade Advisor Peter Navarro will not be joining them.
I will be going to Switzerland, and the negotiations will begin on Saturday. The trade negotiations will be led by myself and Ambassador Jamieson Greer,
and
USTR.
And what about Pete Navarro?
Sorry?
Peter Navarro.
He will not be joining us in Geneva.
As the U.S. and China step up efforts to de-escalate trade tensions, President Xi is in Moscow for a 4-day trip to Russia. It will be his first meeting with Vladimir Putin since Trump rocked global trade with America's most disruptive tariff regime in a century. The visit further showcases the no-limits partnership declared by Xi and Putin, even as the U.S. seeks to rebuild relations with Moscow and take the lead on a ceasefire with Moscow. Meanwhile, the conflict between India and Pakistan is putting a spotlight on China's weapons technology. Pakistan, which has imported a lot of Chinese defense equipment, including J-10C fighter jets, claimed to have shot down a few Indian planes, including a French Rafale jet. This has led to speculation that Chinese defense platforms may have been effectively deployed in that conflict against Western and also Russian platforms. Let's get to our panel of internationally recognized geopolitical forecasters. Victor Gao is Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization and joins us from Beijing. Also with us is George Friedman, founder and chairman of Geopolitical Futures. He's in Austin, Texas. Thank you both for joining us. George, let's start with you. We know that geopolitics are pretty much driving Trump's tariffs. What are you making of the messaging that we're close to perhaps a major trade deal, and perhaps the messaging of the optimism that something will come out of the trade negotiations of the weekend between the U.S. and China?
Well, there's a fundamental issue with China that we don't have with other countries. We've become enormously dependent on Chinese imports, not only for low prices, which is great value, but also as components in our industrial plant. There is a danger, as there was during the Arab oil embargo, that in spite of economic interests of the Arabs, they cut off oil to the United States. We don't expect the Chinese to do that, but we still have to understand that whereas there has to be a financial understanding, there also has to be a geopolitical understanding. The United States and China are mutually hostile in the security area. Not at war, but not friends. And there is always, in financial dealings, a weapon in finance and economics that can be used against the other country. The incredible dependency the United States has in Chinese low prices and efficiency opens the door that if the geopolitical situation shifts, China might limit exports to the United States as a weapon. And I think that has a major dimension to do with it. And this is not just a financial crisis with China, not just an economic one. There is a serious security and geopolitical issue that we have to address. Both have to be solved to solve this problem.
The thing is, both sides have acknowledged that such high tariffs are not sustainable. It is in both countries' interest to make some progress on the trade tensions. Victor, given that the trade negotiations over the weekend in Switzerland is at a high level, what are the chances of some progress being achieved, even if it's just in terms of the positive messaging that may be sent across to the world?
Thank you very much for having me. For the Chinese high officials and the American counterparts to meet this weekend in Switzerland is, in my best judgment, a positive step in the right direction. However, if you read between the lines, the Chinese side does not call it a negotiation. They call it getting in touch with the United States at the request of the United States, meaning they want to tone down any expectation that whatever that comes out of Geneva or Switzerland will be of any great significance, because there is no negotiation. The Americans wanted to talk, and China agreed to meet halfway. They do not want to go to Washington for the talk. They do not want to allow the Americans to come to Beijing for the talk. They want to go to Switzerland for the talk. And if you read how the Chinese frame it, they actually say the Chinese leader, Mr. He, will go to Switzerland for China-Swiss consultation to be followed with China-French consultation in Paris. And in between, they happen to be in Switzerland and they want to meet the American counterpart at the insistence of the United States. Now, what does this mean? My best reading is that China is fully committed to fight this trade war with the United States to the very end if the United States chooses to do so, or China wants to open the door for real negotiation on terms of equality, mutual respect, and for mutual benefit. So we are at this critical moment when China agrees to get in touch with the American counterparts for the possibility of real negotiations. Whatever that will happen in Switzerland will not be called real negotiation at all by any stretch of the imagination, but it will be absolutely in both China's interest and Americans' interest to scale down the tariffs to make sure that free trade prevails, and no one should be allowed to weaponize trade or weaponize tariff or to throw a big wedge into free trade. This is the best message I can get out of this weekend's meeting in Switzerland.
George, do you agree it's not negotiations that we're seeing this weekend within the U.S. and China, bearing in mind as well that both have maintained a pretty hot stance in terms of what and how far they're willing to go?
I think whatever we call it, it's both sides talking to each other. And if you don't want to consider it negotiations, well, nothing will be settled here anyway. It has to go to much higher levels. But again, the Chinese are approaching this as basically a financial confrontation between the United States. There are more dimensions to this confrontation, and they will be risen. For the United States, there are two dimensions, and for the Chinese, there's only one. So that the more the Chinese try to limit this to financial issues, and the more they stand as if they don't have much to lose, as much to lose as the United States, which I don't think is true, the harder the negotiation will be. So whatever the Chinese formal position is, it is diplomatic preface. But the fact is, these are the first talks. What will come of them will be further negotiations, but the negotiations are going to be much more complex than with most other countries.
As you suggested, George, there's a lot to lose for China, but it does seem like China is also preparing itself for a long, drawn-out and tough negotiation process, because we've just seen from the PBOC all those measures which, you know, were more than people expected. It does seem like it is trying to set its economy up for the long haul. Is that a fair assumption?
In any negotiation, you want to go in as if you don't need a deal and you have all the time in the world. Whether you're buying a house or a company, you don't go in there eager for a settlement. But it's very difficult for me to imagine that China, as dependent it is both on American trade and in the past on American investment, can afford to have a breakdown in economic relations with the United States. So I would say that what we are saying, what politicians say is that there is something they think and something they say. I tend to disregard what they say. I take a look at their position. And the Chinese can't afford, any more than the United States can, a long and extended conflict between them economically or politically and militarily.
Victor, we heard George say earlier that negotiations has to be brought up to a much higher level. By that, we mean perhaps, right, it has to be at the level of the two leaders. Here we're talking about Xi Jinping as well as Donald Trump. Can a resolution, can a deal be struck only at that level?
Well, a couple of points, very briefly. I think for China and the United States to yank the tariff against each other on the Chinese side up to 125%, on the American side to a higher percentage, cannot be done without the personal approval of the top leaders of each of these two great nations. That's the first point. The second point is China has declared again and again and again that if the United States want to manhandle this free trade issue, China is prepared to fight to the very end. Now, the question is, what is the very end? What are the possibilities of the very end? Let me really think aloud for the benefit of your audience. I think, according to the Chinese interpretation, one of the end will be the two-way trade between China and the United States grinding to a complete halt. That means there will be no more Chinese exports to the United States, and there will be no more US export to China. Now, does China want to see this happen? Absolutely not. It's against China's own interest. But allow me to emphasize, China has another higher interest. That is free trade. China will never allow any country, no matter how powerful that country is, to really throw a huge wedge into free trade as if it can dictate terms to the rest of the world by holding a gun at China's head or any other country's head. That means the end will be a complete halt and termination of two-way traffic. Now, the United States probably says, well, I want to boycott Chinese exports to the United States or some of the Chinese export to the United States while continuing to have a free walk of American exports to China. That will be completely pipe dream. If it comes to a halt, it will be halting the two-way traffic at whatever economic cost to China, because China will believe That is the only right thing to do, and no country in the world should be allowed or permitted to fight and destroy free trade.
George, what's your take on the end that Victor was talking about? And could China be willing and happy to sacrifice its exports to the U.S. if it means gaining, a strategic footprint, a bigger footprint in the world?
Well, from my point of view, this is a very reasonable opening in negotiations. You both sit down and say, I don't need a deal. The price that China would pay for losing access to the American market would be substantial. So would the price that the Americans would pay. But if the Chinese are absolutely capable of cutting off supplies to the United States, that creates a greater imperative for the United States to back off Chinese trade. Then we must be self-sufficient. Then we must not be importing. So this threat by the Chinese is an argument against free trade, in the sense that if some country shifts out of that, dangers can happen. And that's exactly what the United States is worried about in relation to China. And if it's what China is worried about the United States, then we can talk. So long as we both have the same fears, it's possible to reach an understanding of what will happen. And I think U.S. and China have the same fears. We both fear a breakdown in economic relationships. We both fear war between the two countries. We have much more in common just because each side is being inflexible. Then they will sit down and find a middle ground.
George, I want to refer to your book, The Storm Before the Calm, America's Discord, The Coming Crisis of the 2020s, where you talk about how the U.S. periodically reaches a point of crisis where it appears to be at war with itself, and it is about a country perhaps in transition, reinventing itself. The other take, of course, is whether or not it is actually in terminal decline. How are you looking at those two ideas?
When we look back at the Roosevelt period, or the Reagan period after the Vietnam War, it always appears that the United States is in decline, and the world sort of welcomes it. But the fact is that the United States is a country that invented itself. In our revolution, we created a constitution, and we reinvent ourselves as resources and as institutions become obsolete. So rather than having a long-term evolution, we have short-term crises. We had that when Reagan was elected 50 years before that when Roosevelt was elected, and so on and so forth. This is a healthy way in which the United States operates. It is not the way the rest of the world operates. And in this time, there is strife within the United States. Roosevelt was called a dictator, and he went to war with the Supreme Court. So I would say that this is the norm for the United States. It is not the norm for other countries. And they draw imperfect conclusions if they think this represents weakness in the United States. This is one of the strengths of the United States. We're not afraid to have chaos in the process of reinvention.
Victor, even as we cast our eyes at the upcoming U.S.-China trade talks this weekend, the U.S. itself is in the midst of negotiating with at least a dozen economies. I'm just wondering, what's the take from China, given that there is a sense that the U.S. is likely to gather its trading partners and try to isolate China, especially on the issue of chips?
First of all, allow me to mention one point from the depth of my heart. For China, with its size, with its strength, with its deliverability, and with its 5,000 years of history, when we hear about any country or any groups of countries talking about isolating China, do you know what's the response? We chuckle, because from my perspective, it's a mission impossible. You dare to isolate China? You're talking about kind of isolating the world in a sense. China is the largest trading partner with more than 140 nations in the world. And you want to isolate China? You want to really break up all these economic relations? It's a fantasy. Never try that, because otherwise you'll end up in great failure. Now, on the other hand, yes, we know that the United States is talking with many countries But for the United States to launch this unprecedented, largest scale tariff war or trade war, it's like holding a gun at every country's head and say, kneel down and talk to me on my terms and don't strike me back. Now, every country faces different circumstances. Many countries, it will not be surprising, will need to give in to the pressure of the United States. But you ask them in the bottom of their heart, in the depth of the night, whether they like to have a gun pointed at their head. I can assure you, based on all my education, all my judgment, all my sanity, all my wisdom, no country likes to have a gun pointed at their head to negotiate with the United States. Therefore, I hope I can tell President Trump and people around him, don't struggle against free trade. Follow the principle of free trade. And the United States seems to be a standard bearer of free trade for many decades.
Right.
Now, the standard falls into the hands of China, and China wants to be the champion and the standard bearer of free trade. This is the difference we are talking about.
Lots of complications for the world right now, including what's happening in South Asia, the conflict between India and Pakistan. George, let's start with you. When it comes to the role that the U.S. can play, how do you think it can, what can it do to help de-escalate the tensions there?
Well, the United States wants to not dominate the world, not frighten the world, not point hands. It wants to pull back from the world. For the last 80 years, the United States has been in a Cold War, a war that frequently turned hot, where many Americans died, other countries died. And the United States has the ability not to reshape the world, but to reshape itself. And one of the features of the United States that makes it such great power is when it reshapes itself and it reshapes its relationship with the world seems shocked, as if it's unreasonable. But we have been in a Cold War for a long time, and that's why we are trying to negotiate with the Russians and back out of this war in Ukraine. And this is why we're trying to negotiate with the Chinese. So if the Chinese don't want to negotiate, well, that's their choice. But it is American options for what they want to do that is driving this. It is not holding a gun to the head. It is trying to take a different course in history. And that is the right of every sovereign country, China included. China will decide what it has to do, but there's no gun being pointed at their head.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. Great insights. Victor Gao from the Center for China and Globalization and George Friedman of Geopolitical Futures. And a little later in the program, hear what one former ambassador to the U.S. has to say about how trading partners should deal with a Trump White House.
I think people are hoping for some good space to land where they would land. And because President Trump has been unpredictable.
Our exclusive conversation with Singapore's Ambassador at Large, Chan Heng Chee, coming right up. Also ahead, we speak to Indian Member of Parliament, Shashi Tharoor, on the unfolding tensions with Pakistan and the risk of further escalation. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. You're watching Inside. We're counting down to the India Open in about 15 minutes. Front and center, the escalating tensions between Pakistan as well as India, of course, the tit for tat. Pakistan now says it reserves the right to retaliate after India launched targeted strikes, signaling a potential further escalation in hostilities between the two nuclear-armed rivals. Taking a look at where we are in terms of the Nifty futures, pointing to a higher open, up by about 0.5%. And in terms of the Indian rupee, we have indications of the rupee trading higher versus the USD, up against 0.2% as we speak right now. That's amidst tensions between India and Pakistan. Pakistan now saying it reserves the right to retaliate. We're also keeping an eye on assets in Europe on the back of a report by New York Times that perhaps a big deal, a major deal will be struck, will be released momentarily between the U.S. as well as the U.K. Trump expected to announce that trade deal with Britain imminently. We have futures pointing to higher open. Currently, we have the FTSE 100 futures up by about 0.7%. We've already seen how it's lifted the pound in particular. Currently, the pound, though, is trading higher by 0.5%, and the euro pretty much higher versus USD as well, up by 0.3%. So those assets are getting a lift from news that a major trade deal with the U.S. may be imminent. Now, a top Singapore diplomat, meantime, warning there's no clear roadmap to improve ties between the U.S. and China in disputes over everything from trade to Taiwan. I spoke with Ambassador-at-Large and former envoy to the U.S., Chan Heng Chee, from Bloomberg's New Voices Singapore launch. She says the speed and scope of President Trump's policy changes has been a shock.
President Trump, candidate Donald J. Trump, ran on the promise of disruption, and he laid out all the policies that he said he would do, and he did exactly that. But still, I think most of us were shocked, and some were awed. Why? I think it's because of the speed in which things have happened, the speed, the scope, and perhaps the extent, and that has really surprised everyone.
If you take a look at Europe, it is building its own defenses. It's increased its defense budget, for instance. If you take a look at South Korea, it's thinking about going the nuclear way. How are you looking at whether or not these countries will undo the measures that they're adopting at this point in time?
I don't think many of America's allies and partners see America as a foe, even though they are very uncomfortable with what the United States, the policies seem to be portending, the tariff war and so on. What do countries do? They try to bargain, talk their way out, see whether you can land at a different space. Because President Trump has been unpredictable, there's reciprocal tariffs and he pulls it back 90 days and so on. So the question is, in the end, who is the target? Are all these countries target, or is it just targeted at China? And countries are doing different things. But it is true, you are right. In terms of defense, President Trump has in fact indicated that he wants to deconstruct the order that America has created, that countries should not expect a free ride on American defense and assistance. And in a way, we have been free riding, so countries can expect to pay more. I think that will happen. And so there's some adjustment there. But I think you'll see hedging. They're not foes, but they'll hedge. They hedge in different ways.
You talk about hedging. Does hedging involve getting closer to China? Have you seen that? Do you expect that?
Hedging will, countries at the moment is only 100 days, all right? And people are
quite a good indication of what can be expected in the country.
Yes, I think but there are many countries that are still just trying to deal with the tariffs immediately. They haven't moved to the next phase yet. So, and it seems now, if you look over the 100 days, the countries that dealt or are dealing with President Trump, the United States, with some calm and in a collected, poised way, seem to be having some effect. Show strength, and you'll be respected. So there's a bit of that. If you look at the cases, Mark Carney, Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, so countries are remaining slightly calm. And President Trump, he listens, and sometimes he changes his mind. So that can happen, So coming back to your question, then what will they do, So I think in terms of whether they will move towards China immediately, there are signals. China is talking to Europe. Europe is talking to China. What I think has changed most is that What President Biden did, which was to collect all the countries in Europe, gather the Europeans in a kind of coalition, a loose coalition, to balance China, to counter China. I think Europeans are now not going to go there.
And that was Singapore's Ambassador at Large, Chan Heng Chee, at our New Voices 2025 event. Also joining me at the event in Singapore was Citibank Singapore CEO and Head of Wealth for Asia South, Wenxian, who says investors should stick with U.S. equities. However, she warns against buying the dip. Here's my exclusive interview with her from the New Voices Singapore.
There's just too much news. You know, the news changes every day, right? You go to sleep hearing one thing, you wake up hearing a different thing. You don't know what to do. So again, our advice is stay the course. Don't buy the dip. Look for quality. And you should rebalance your portfolio. So I think in wealth, it's all about the world's changing. So what you would do yesterday could be different from what you do tomorrow. But it's really important for clients to also know what they want to achieve in the longer term. And what the role that we play is to help our clients discover, like, what, you know, have clarity, what do they want to do in the longer term.
But give us a sense of kind of rotation.
Yes. So it's not the time to add risk. So if you think that, like, stocks have come down, it's the right time to go in, we're actually telling clients don't buy into the dip. You can rotate into money market funds. Look for bond funds with shorter duration assets. Look for companies with lower volatility in their earnings. I think this is the advice we're telling clients.
When we take a look at tariffs, some say that it will impact the way economies grow. In fact, there's already been projections where estimates have been cut pretty much across the board. How does that help or hinder wealth creation? How are we looking at growing the business, for instance?
Okay. So at Citi, the clients that we love are the ones who are change makers and who are creating wealth. And that hasn't changed. I think in the world that we live in, there's still a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity. So, and that's true for, you know, like corporate companies as well. So again, like, look for where their innovation is happening. It still continues to happen in the world that we live in. In fact, in a disruptive world, there's probably even more opportunities for, you know, companies to differentiate themselves, for entrepreneurs to differentiate themselves, and to be disruptive as well, you know, to kind of play into the disruption and to leverage it, create wealth, create growth, create value.
We talk about the rotation. A lot of people talk about that rotation out of the US into this part of the world. Mm-hmm. What are you seeing in terms of the regions you cover? Southeast Asia, UAE, for instance, comes under you as well. Are you seeing that?
We are definitely seeing some rebalancing. The reality is the US is a very, very big market. So we wouldn't recommend the clients to exit the US markets altogether. I think US markets, the capital markets, about like 70% of the global market. So not to have US exposure also means that you're not exposing yourself to where there's still a lot of like growth, especially in the technology space.
Citibank Singapore CEO and Head of Wealth for Asia South, Wenxian, from the launch of Bloomberg's New Voices Singapore. That is an intensive media training initiative focused on amplifying the perspectives of senior women in finance in Singapore, as well as Southeast Asia. Now, here's a look. We're back to markets. Indian markets just ahead of the open against a backdrop of Pakistan saying that it deserves the right to respond to the Indian attack this week. Of course, we know that India's military strikes against Pakistan early Wednesday led to a setback for India's equity market, with a further escalation threatening a nascent recovery in foreign inflows into the local shares. Though today we're seeing gains for the Sensex, pointing to gains currently up by 0.2% gains too for the rest of the benchmarks. Of course, front and center as well is the Fed decision that might be playing out as well in terms of investor sentiment. In terms of the Indian rupee trading higher against the USD, up by 0.3%. Now, just ahead, Congress leader and Indian Member of Parliament Shashi Tharoor will be joining us with his insights on why Kashmir remains a political lightning rod and how the latest conflict with Pakistan might just play out. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. You're watching Inside. Pakistan says it reserves the right to retaliate further after India launched what it called targeted strikes on terrorist camps in Pakistani territory. Pakistan's army says 31 civilians were killed in the deepest breach of its territory since the two countries' 1971 war. India, meanwhile, says it conducted a precise and restrained response that was designed to be non-escalatory in nature. Well, joining us now is Shashi Tharoor, a member of parliament and leader of the Indian National Congress. He currently chairs the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. Dr. Tharoor, good to have you with us. It's tit for tat. This escalation, is there a threat of it getting out of control?
Well, I mean, the first question to be asked is whether people can just march across your border and kill innocent civilian tourists with impunity, or whether some response is justified. I believe there is no question in the minds of most people around the world that India has a right to defend itself against terrorism and to retaliate when terrorists strike. And that's exactly what India has done. But India has done so in a completely calibrated, calculated, and precise manner, precisely in order to avoid any escalation. You will notice that they only struck terrorist infrastructure, that they went out of their way to do so at night, between 1:05 a.m. and 1:30, when you don't expect too many civilians to be wandering around, in order to minimize collateral damage. Indeed, the people who killed were people who were inside these terrorist establishments and receiving training to be future terrorists. And as far as we're concerned, there is very little doubt that India's action was undertaken with a great deal of care to avoid striking any Pakistani government installations or Pakistani military facilities. It is not because we believe the Pakistani military is innocent. On the contrary, we have absolutely incontrovertible evidence over decades that these terrorists are spawned, directed, financed, equipped, trained, and sent by the Pakistani military. But even then, we wanted to convey that this action was not meant to be the opening salvo in a protracted war, but rather a one-off retaliation for a terrorist outrage. And I think for all of these reasons, India has every reason to look back and say, we didn't do anything that justifies a further escalation.
Dr. Tharoor, I just want to throw it out there that Pakistan maintains it did not make that strike. I just want to also follow up that India has often tried to resolve issues through diplomatic means. What's changed this time?
What changed, unfortunately, is the bitter experience of all such efforts over the years. 2008, 26/11, when the Pakistani terrorists killed 170 civilians in India. What do we do in Mumbai? And what do? We chose the diplomatic route. We tried to have this condemned. We got the terrorist organizations blacklisted in the UN Security Council. We got Pakistan grey-listed in the Financial Action Task Force for supporting terrorism. All of this, but we did not take any military action. When the next big terrorist attack happened in Pathankot, we even invited the Pakistanis to participate in the investigation. They sent their intelligence people to India, and they went back and said, oh, the Indians did it to themselves. That was the last straw. So the next terrorist attack in Uri, India sent across a squad across the line of control to attack the base from which the terrorists came. Next terrorist attack, one step above, there was a killing of 40 Indian soldiers in Pulwama. India conducted a one-off airstrike in a place called Balakot in Pakistan. Next atrocity, you can see the very gradual calibrated response. Next atrocity, the 26 tourists being killed by the terrorists in Pahalgam in Kashmir, we hit 9 strikes. The message is clear. You continue doing this filthy, dirty game of killing innocent people to pursue your vile agenda, we will hit back. And it'll get worse each time. It's been a very slow, measured thing. The pattern I've described to you is really in response to terrorist attacks that have taken place over 3 decades. It's been a very slow and measured increase, but an increase there is, and further increases there will be if the Pakistanis give us cause to.
Could the attack have been prevented, Dr. Tharoor, avoided? Because the Congress Party, the opposition, says that there was an intelligence failure. If you had had the intelligence, you wouldn't have had the attack.
Now, I'm sorry, if people don't send terrorists across to kill Indians, then we wouldn't have had an attack in the first place. Yes, there would have arguably been an intelligence failure, but no country has 100% foolproof intelligence. Even Israel, with its worldwide reputation for intelligence excellence, was taken by surprise on October 7th, 2023. These things happen. It doesn't mean that you excuse the killers because you say that your intelligence failed. As far as I'm concerned, the first and principal responsibility for any such situation is that of the people who did the unjustified and unprovoked killing in the first place. In other words, the terrorists.
At this stage, people are asking if that could be a prolonged de-escalation. This is an attack, in Kashmir, over Kashmir, and an issue that goes back to 1948. There has not been a resolution since. Is there a way forward?
Well, I mean, the way forward is through democracy, through human rights, through elections, all of which happen on the Indian side of the border and don't happen on the Pakistani side of the dividing line. As far as we're concerned, we can definitely find a peaceful way forward. This is a subcontinent that was united for millennia before Pakistan was created artificially by the departing British from the stooped shoulders of their colonial possession, India, in 1947. The fact is, of course we can live side by side. 200 million Muslims live in peace in India. You don't need to create separate countries because of your religion. You certainly don't need to covet other people's territory because of the religion of the people who live there. We believe that's a deeply bigoted attitude on the part of those who claim that they want to seize Kashmir because of the religion of the majority of its inhabitants. We're not going to accept that proposition at any point. India is determined to promote democracy, freedom, integration, prosperity for the people of Kashmir. That's what the terrorists sought to strike. Tourism was booming, the Kashmiri economy was thriving, and as a result, they thought by killing tourists, driving tourists away, and thereby damaging severely the Kashmir economy, they would be able to increase disaffection in Kashmir. It's a cynical ploy. It's exactly the kind of thinking that we associate with the malign and evil men who unfortunately have disproportionate influence in the Pakistani deep state.
I want to talk about China. It says it remains committed to supporting Pakistan. What role do you think China can play? And I'm just wondering how that may affect warming relations between India and China.
Well, look, China issued a very constructive statement yesterday. Of course, we realize that Pakistan is basically a client state of China's, that China's biggest project under the Belt and Road Initiative is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor down to Gwadar, which would certainly save the Chinese an awful lot of money in shipping goods to Western China, to Xinjiang and other provinces in the West, through Pakistan, rather than going all the way around India, Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, and then overland from Guangzhou, which is what it used to be doing. So all that we understand that China has very, very strong interests in supporting its so-called all-weather friend in Pakistan. Nonetheless, China's statement yesterday that both India and Pakistan are our neighbors, and we don't want to see our neighbors having a conflict with each other, and calling therefore for de-escalation and peace, was a very constructive message. And if they're giving that message to Pakistan as well, that we don't think you really need a war right now, buddies, maybe people in Islamabad will listen. They can't really afford not to.
Dr. Tharoor, of course, this conflict happening at a time when trade negotiations are happening, and there's optimism that India would be among the first to strike a deal with the U.S. How optimistic are you about that, and when might that happen?
Well, as you know, they've given themselves a rather long period of negotiating time. Mr. Trump announced when Mr. Modi, the Prime Minister of India, visited the White House that they would have until the fall to agree on a bilateral trade agreement. I certainly hope it'll happen much sooner than that, because it's in India's interest as well to clinch a deal with the US while deals are on offer, as it were. There is a certain unpredictability involved in prolonging any such negotiation. And as far as I know, the negotiations are making good headway. There was a huge 18-member US trade delegation that came to India last month. And I think a somewhat smaller Indian team is back in Washington talking right now. I hope it'll progress. We've seen some very good results in the UK already, where India and the UK announced a trade agreement just a few days ago. I think the US may well be next. So it's certainly a good sign.
Let's talk about that trade deal with the UK. It was 3 years in the making. How does it suggest a new era of trade between the two countries?
Well, look, it's early days yet. We have an agreement. We don't yet have any changes in trade happening right away. But what is particularly striking to me is the fact that we will now have zero duty exports of textiles, of jewelry, of machinery, of furniture, of sports goods, leather and footwear, ceramics and so on from India to the UK, all of which are products we make in our small and medium sector, and this will actually benefit small manufacturers in India. We'll also, of course, have some easier visa rules for contractual service providers, which is not a bad thing for us to have.
Right.
From the UK's point of view, they'll sell us even more Scotch. And we're buying a lot of Scotch in India these days with high duties. They'll sell us more because the duties will go down dramatically. They'll also have the opportunity to sell us automobiles and so on. So I think in many ways there's going to be significant improvement, but we will have to see it happening in practice.
Dr. Tharoor? We have to leave it there. Shashi Tharoor, Indian Member of Parliament and leader of the Indian National Congress. That is it for Insight. Horizons Middle East and Africa is next. Keep it here with us. This is Bloomberg.